Hello, this is Paul Chapman and welcome to another Sabbath Bible Lessons Teachers Help video. And we're going through this quarter, the light of the world. And this quarterly looks at how God used human instruments to be a light to the world and their generation from the time of Adam right through to the end of Israel's pilgrimage in the wilderness. Now, the lesson for this week is entitled Moses. So just for those who haven't tuned in so far in our series of the Sabbath Bible Lessons video helps, what I'm doing is around the world I'm showing a method of teaching this lesson so that you're just not reading the verses like reading the question as it's put here and then reading the Bible verse or reading the note. Too many people think that that's teaching the lesson. What we want to do is apply the method, what I'm encouraging of the coming up with an outline for the lesson in your own mind or on paper of how you're going to teach it. That outline would begin with a main point of the lesson. So what is the main point for this week's lesson? Then we would go through each day looking for the points to establish that main point. So basically what we're going to be doing, you go through the lesson, look at the points from each day, come up with a main point and then present that main point to the lesson in terms of the macro method of teaching. That is, the macro would be the main point. The micro points you would then go through to support that main point, and then we summarise all those micro points at the end to bring them back to the macro point of the lesson, which is the main point. So, and then we make a personal application of the lesson to the class or the students in our class for that day, a personal and practical application. So I'm just doing this in order to you as a teacher. If you're not a teacher, that's fine. You'll get something out of this, I'm sure. But for teachers in general, just so to give you an idea of maybe you're not quite sure what the main point is. Maybe there's some points here that you weren't aware of, and I'll just highlight some that were meaningful for me, and perhaps you can use these in your classes. Now, also, we're looking at a method of markup I'm encouraging, and that is this. You can see there we've got some symbols. I use the asterisk for a new concept, I use the arrow for a personal need, I use the plus symbol for a personal help, and the hash symbol is something the class should understand. I use that quite extensively throughout my lessons as a way of honing in on the main points of the lessons that you can see there using those hash symbols. So that helps me when I'm going through the lesson of where to hone in for that day, particularly if I'm short of time. I know if I turn to the bell rings, I've only got 5 minutes to go, and I've got 2 days still to go, I can at least hone in on that asterisk, or rather the hash symbol, to bring out the point at least for that day. So let's begin with this lesson. Now, I don't know how about you, but what did I come up with as my main point? I thought this, it's a beautiful Bible verse, and the little key verse and the key note is very, very good. To summarise it, I thought this. In preparing us to be, because remember it's in the context of the overall lesson, which is to be the light of the world, and in preparing us to be light bearers, God chooses us not because of what we are, but of what we might become when connected with Him. Now, we're going to see this brought out in the life of Moses. So let me just repeat that. God chooses us to be light bearers for Him to our generation, not because of what we are, but because of what we might become when we're connected with Him. And looking at the life of Moses and seeing how this is brought out, let's take a look. So firstly, we're given the key reference there from Hebrews 11, 24 to 26. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the children of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. So, in other words, Moses looked beyond the beauties and attractions of Egypt. He's beyond the crown that was due to him as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, and he looked to the crown that will be bestowed upon the saints of the Most High. That's where his hope was, and he could see beyond the temporal to the eternal. And this led him to make certain decisions and take certain stands and take certain actions that perhaps we wouldn't have taken in his situation had we not seen the eternal realities. And this is what this lesson is about today. So let's have a look at it. Firstly, looking at Moses' training. Remember, to be a light of the world. Now, God had, we saw last week in the life of Joseph that his brothers were there with him in Egypt, and they grew. They were dwelling there in Egypt, and they became a great nation. We don't really cover that transition from being a small family of about 70 or 75 souls into becoming a great nation. But by the time of Moses now, they've become a great nation there in the land of Egypt. And we have here now is with Moses training, God was now fulfilling his purpose. Remember that he promised to Abraham that in thy seed all nations of the earth would be blessed. That is, that the seed that to come would be coming through the line of Abraham, that promised seed of Jesus Christ, the Saviour for the world. He would be a light for the Gentiles, and his people, God's people, would the chosen ones of Israel, were to be a light in their generation. Now, for that to happen, they had to become a great nation and be given a land of their own where they could practice the laws of God and display his attributes to the world around them. So Moses was now going to be called by God to deliver Israel from Egypt. But now let's have a look at his training for this. Firstly, now because the children of Israel had grown to become so vast in numbers, the Egyptians feared that they would outnumber them and overthrow them. So Pharaoh ordered that all the babies that were born, when the Egyptian midwives took care of the birth of the babies, and they were to kill all the sons that were born, and the daughters they were to keep alive. But the midwives failed to do this. They feared God, and they did not do this, and Pharaoh got mad with it and said, okay, they were to be thrown into the river. All the men child, he charged everybody everywhere. All the sons that were born of the Israelites were to be thrown into the river, and the daughters were to be kept alive. Now, it was interesting that as a result of that command, one of the Hebrew families had a child, and that child, that mother of that child, made a basket out of bulrush reeds, and she placed the child into the basket and obviously let the basket go in the river. So the child was thrown into the river, but it was in a basket. Quite ingenious. Now, God used that for a wonderful purpose, and we'll have a look at what that purpose is. Now, we see how Moses was drawn from the river. That's what the word Moses means, drawn out, by Pharaoh's daughter. She found this little basket there when she went out to the river to bathe, and the basket was drawn out, and there was Moses, this little baby in there, and he was given, of course, his sister Miriam, who was a young girl. She saw when Pharaoh's daughter found Moses, and she offered to find a handmaid for her that would nurse the child. And so Moses ended up being given back to his mother as a nurse, and she was then able to raise Moses in her household until he had come of age, where he would then be taken into Pharaoh's household. And so let's have a look here. When Moses, I'm just looking at section number 1, when Jochebed was given this man-child back to her as a responsibility now to raise for Pharaoh's courts, how did she do that? How did she take that on board? I think she would have realised that God had something special for him. This was a special purpose, because God preserved, in answer to her own prayers, God preserved the life of Moses. So I believe that she would have taken a special regard for the fact that he was going to be placed in Pharaoh's court, surrounded by idolatry, surrounded by all the treasures and all the glory and pomp and display of Egypt, and in particular all the idols of Egypt. And she wanted to ensure that this child was a worshipper of the true God of heaven. And so I think that she would have taken that responsibility very seriously. As the note there brings out, I'll be emphasising this. She says here, she faithfully improved, because she knew that she didn't have this child wouldn't have the child for a very long time. So she took it upon herself to improve every opportunity she had to educate her child for God. As the note there brings out, that she endeavoured to imbue his mind with the fear of God and love of truth and justice, and earnestly pray that he might be preserved from every corrupting influence. Okay, so, and that example of Jochebed was a wonderful example for us. Proverbs 22 in the next section, part B, Proverbs 22 verse 6 says, to train up a child in the way that he should go. And what's the promise given there? When he is old, he will not depart from it. And I think Jochebed was a wonderful example in that. She trained up Moses to such a point that Moses knew who he was. He knew he was not the son of Pharaoh or Pharaoh's daughter. He knew that he had a Hebrew heritage. And so as he took that with him into the courts of Pharaoh, and that enabled him to be true to the God of his mother's people. So he was faithful. He proved faithful to that training of his mother. So let's have a look now. He's gone in under Monday's lesson. He's gone into the king's court, and what happens there? Well, in the king's court, it tells us obviously he would have been as being the daughter of Pharaoh, rather being the son of Pharaoh's daughter, or counted as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He would have been trained to rule in the courts of Pharaoh. And so we are told there in Acts 7:22 that he was educated he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and it was recorded there that he was mighty in words and deeds. So he was a significant figure in the eyes, not just of the Hebrews, but in the eyes of the Egyptians themselves. He received, we're told in the note there, and it comes from Patriarchs and Prophets, that he received the highest civil and military training, and in doing so, he became a military leader that made him a favourite with the armies of Egypt, and he was generally regarded as a remarkable character. So this training he was receiving in the king's court was the best training the world had to offer at that time. Now, what impact do you think that would have had on him? And I've often wondered that. So you've got the early childhood training, and now you have, perhaps I would imagine in his teenage years now he's gone on from primary school. Perhaps in those primary school years, we could imagine he was under the care of his mother, of his natural mother, being trained by her in the religious education or religious instruction he was being given, was that of the Hebrews' religion, of that of the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. And now he's in the Egyptian court in his teenage years, being bombarded with all this culture and wisdom and idolatry of Egypt. Now, how did he receive all this? Well, Part B wants us to discuss this in the lesson. Now, I'd just be encouraging that discussion based on the note. There's no verse given because it's really just a discussion question, but there's a note there that suggests to us just the impact that training had on him and what result. Now, it says, I'd highlight this point to my class, that while he was an ardent and untiring student, so he was respectful of his teachers and a very ardent student, he could not be induced to participate in the worship of the gods of Egypt. Now, I think that's very significant. So faithful was that training of his early years. He was unshaken in his determination to render homage to none save the one God, the maker of heaven and earth. And so this, I guess, would have put him at odds in the court. And I think in your classes, I'd be emphasising this to especially if you're teaching a younger generation class, that God is going to place you in circumstances that is going to test your faith. But like Moses, if you'll be true to him, and be resolved that not to allow anything to induce you to turn from the worship of the true God and from acting according to his principles, the principles of his word, then that's being a light to the world around us. So when Moses came to that point in his experience where it was either a choice. I guess a choice must have come to him of either choosing now between the throne of Egypt or delivering of his people. Now, I imagine he would have been educated from his mother that that his people were only to be sojourning there for a period of time. Now, they would have God had said to Abraham they were going to be there for 430 years or thereabouts. So that time period obviously would have been coming to an end, and they knew that time was coming to be delivered. And so Moses, we read here that he, and this is where the key note comes out here now, the key verse rather, that he, by faith, when he was come to years, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So it was when his adult life he refuses to acknowledge his lineage to the throne of Egypt, and he chooses rather to suffer affliction with God's people. I think that's an amazing choice he has made, considering the wealth, the glory, the honour, the majesty, the absolute power and authority he would have commanded as the monarch of Egypt, because that's where he was headed at that time. So we're told that, in terms of his learning, in terms of his knowledge and character, he says here, his intellectual greatness distinguishes him above the great men of all ages. As historian, poet, philosopher, general of armies and legislator, he stands without a peer. So in terms of his intellectual attainments, without a peer. But I think it's the moral attainments that stand out for me in this section. That is, that he made that moral choice not to be influenced by the idolatry, to turn from all what was offered to him, the entire world at his feet, to turn from that in order to be true to God and to be an instrument in God's hands to deliver his children of Israel from Egypt, in order that they might fulfill the promise that God had made to Abraham to be a blessing to the world around them, and that they might be that light to the world. And so now we find Moses, it doesn't go into details here, we know what happened. He took it upon in his own hands to deliver Israel, didn't wait for God to fulfill his plan or purpose in his own time and way. And Moses found himself therefore by slaying one of the Egyptians who was inflicting some unjust punishment on a Hebrew slave. Moses killed the Egyptian and buried him, and then that led to people fearing that Moses was going to do the same to them, and the word got back to Pharaoh's courts, and now Moses was a criminal, and now on the run from Pharaoh and his courts. So he found his way into the land of Midian, and there was Jethro, the priest of Midian, and there he landed a job looking after Jethro's sheep. And Jethro gave him a daughter of one of his own, and to be the wife of Moses, and he married there. Now during that time, we now find him in the land of Midian as a shepherd. And if you look at the rough period of time here, he was 40 years there in Egypt. Now he's another 40 years in the desert as a shepherd, taking care of the sheep, like in the wilderness, I should say, taking care of sheep. And why do you think God did that? Allowed that to happen? I think Moses, through his talents and through his abilities, would have been trained quite aptly to lead Pharaoh's armies, but God wanted to train Moses in a different way. God, before the note brings that before he could govern wisely, Moses must learn to obey. That is, to obey God. That is, not in his own way, time and way, but in God's time and way. That is, he was to learn, as it says here in the note, to learn patience, to temper his passion, because I imagine he would have been very passionate about what he saw there when that Hebrew slave was being whipped by the Egyptians, and he just rose up in anger against him, and that caused a whole heap of problems. God needed a leader who could control his passions, and that's an attribute that is essential in all leaders if they are to be a representative of God. So it goes on to say there in the note, to be emphasising that Moses' own heart must be fully in harmony with God before he could teach the knowledge of his will to Israel. So that should be the points I'll be emphasising there. Now, after that 40 years, you can imagine 40 years of a shepherd in the wilderness. You know, I used to be in recruitment and as a recruitment consultant, and you go through hundreds of resumes a day. People would send in to you for various jobs that were on offer. So you're reading all through these resumes, and people spend a lot of time listing all the skills they've done, maybe the last 20 years. But a consultant, all they're interested in is seeing the last 5 years, because if you don't use it, you lose it. And the last 5 years of your job history, because that's where your skill set's going to be honed to. At least the last, no longer than the last 5 years. And so with Moses, I'm sure he would have forgotten a lot. That 40 years in the wilderness would have forgotten a lot. But what did he learn in that 40 years of working as a shepherd there in the wilderness? He would have learned, I believe, the patience, love, and care that a shepherd has for his flock. That's the thing that Moses would have learned, I believe. And it was said there in Numbers 12 verse 3, at the end of that period, it says Moses was the meekest man upon the earth. And that was not a thing to glory in, because to be meek is a belittling sort of a comment in that culture of his time. So to say that, it just shows how humble he had become in that 40 years of wilderness training, if you like. Now, so in terms of ourselves, we just look at our own example. God sometimes takes us through those same experiences that we need to, as much as lies within us. I mean, this part C rather, just brings us out. When we're dealing with people, we need to live peaceably as much as possible with all men. To do that requires earnest prayer, effort, to overcome those passionate traits in our characters that lead us to lose our cool at times. It leads us not to reflect the character of Jesus to the world around us. And so the note brings out, we must, in order to receive God's help, we must realise, I emphasise this, we must realise our weakness and deficiency, and to apply our own mind to overcoming, those weak spots in our lives. Okay, to overcome, he must apply his own mind to the great change to be wrought in himself. And many never attain to the position that God might have them occupy, because they wait for God to do for them that which he's given them power to do for themselves. And I think with Moses, he took on board the fact, okay, maybe this is not God's way, and he learnt the lessons that God wanted him to teach. He was basically forced to learn them, I think, but there in the wilderness, he learnt the care and the patience he needed to learn. So now, when it comes to ourselves, when it comes to working for God, when the call comes upon us, the next section of the lesson brings out here, no weakness, no excuse rather for human weakness. Let me just bring this back up here again. No excuse for human weakness. This section highlights for me the fact that, when God calls you, you may feel unworthy, you may feel incapable of doing the work that he's called you to, but his biddings are his enablings. So God's biddings are his enablings. So if he bids you to a work, he bids you to a responsibility, don't fear. He will give you what you need. And I thought it was remarkable that Moses, after being so long there in the wilderness, when God did finally call him back to go back to Egypt as an instrument in his hand to deliver Israel, Moses said, I'm just, my speech is poor, I'm slow of speech, I'm unable to communicate effectively. And God said to him, basically, who's made your mouth? Who makes the dumb and the blind and the lame? I mean, it's God that is in control of all these things. If God calls you, you go. And God will give you what you need. And so we will gain, as we accept the responsibility that God places upon us, he will give us the power and efficiency we need. That's what I'll be emphasising here. He gives us the power and the efficiency that we need in order to be faithful to the trust that he gives us. And we simply have to trust, as the Apostle Paul said, I'm reminded of this as well. The Apostle Paul said, when I am weak, then I am strong. And Paul was had a thorn in the flesh, which I believe was poor eyesight as a result of that blinding on the road to Damascus. And that was a thorn in his flesh, but it kept him humble. It made him realise his weakness. And I think that Moses, probably in the same way, 40 years there in the wilderness, not speaking to hardly anyone but his own family, he just, how can I be a spokesperson for God to all these millions of people? And I think that realization kept him humble, And so God will do the same for us. As long as we have our realization of our weakness, will be a means of keeping us humble and dependent upon God, so that He can use us the way He wants to use us. But I note under here, though, also under this lesson for Wednesday, under B, that when Moses was on his way back to Egypt, an angel appeared there threatening to take his life, I believe. So this says the Lord sought to kill him, it says there in Exodus chapter 4. And the reason being that his son that Moses had was not circumcised. He allowed his wife to hold him back from that. She wasn't an Israelite. She wasn't part of Abraham's family. So this child, she hadn't circumcised, or hadn't had the son circumcised. So Moses was now threatened with death, and so he circumcised his son. I just think it shows that, you might think that's a small thing. Why would God do that? But I think it shows that this was God's requirement under the terms of the covenant, that every man-child would be circumcised. God expects obedience. I think that's important for us as Christians to understand. God does expect us to obey. He enables us to obey. He gives us the power to obey. Not that we do it, for some kind of meritorious work before God, but we just do it because we love to do it. And unfortunately, Moses had neglected this. In his weakness, he allowed his wife to influence him, but now he takes it upon himself to have his son circumcised and continues on to his journey. And that just emphasised for us under C that to obey is better than sacrifice. That's what God requires. To him that knows to do good and does it not, to him it is sin. But Moses knew that what he should have done and didn't do it. So God required, the Lord cannot accept us as leaders if we persist in willful violation of one of his commands. He cannot accept us, even as his child, if you persist in willful violation. So now looking at our last section of the lesson, what's the essential qualification for service? That's what the title's brought out here. And it's a beautiful little thought here. When it comes to the service of God, it's the essential quality is the quality that was emphasised there in the experience of Peter and the exchange between Peter and Jesus after Jesus had resurrected. And there was Peter who had denied him terribly, and Jesus now asked him the question, Peter, do you love me? And Peter said, Lord, you know I love you. Before that, Peter was Lord, I'm willing to go to you, you're willing to go to the death for you. But now, Peter, meek and humble, simply says, Lord, you know I love you. And that's the question, lovest thou me? That's the essential question that we need to answer. We can have all the talent, we can have as the note brings out, I just emphasise this in my own lesson here, knowledge, benevolence, eloquence, gratitude and zeal are all aids in God's work. But without the love of Jesus in the heart, the work of the Christian minister is a failure. So we can have all the talent, we can have all the eloquence, all the gratitude, all the zeal, all the knowledge, all the benevolence, but without the love of Jesus in our hearts, it's a failure. So, how do we know? And this next question brings out, or puts it to us, how do we know that Moses had this quality? Well, I think it was demonstrated later on, as these verses bring out, that when his people were threatened with death because of their disobedience to the terms of the covenant they just entered into with God, there's the millions of children of Israel, they had bowed down to worship the golden calf. God in anger was going to punish them, and Moses punished them with death, by the way. Moses then pleaded with God to not destroy them. He appealed to God to do not blot them out of existence, but rather blot me out of your book. Moses placed his own life, or placed their lives before his own. So he was willing to lay down his life for theirs. I mean, that just shows the love of Moses for his people, and that's the love that Jesus had for us. That he was prepared to lay down his life for his children, and so God, God tested his faithfulness, as it brings out there, and his love for that erring, ungrateful people. And nobly had Moses endured the trial. And that test will come to us constantly. Lovest thou me more than these? And do we love God with more than our own life? Do we love his people more than our own life? Are we prepared to lay down our life for the salvation of the souls around us? That's what God wants, the attitude God wants in each one of us. So we can see here, God, he took Moses and started with material he knew he could work with, and he trained him. It took 80 years of training, but he nevertheless trained him and prepared him to be what he wanted him to be in order to be that light for the world in his generation. So may God help you and bless you in your presentation of the lesson this week. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. If you have, please pass it on to others. Appreciate that, and till next time, take care, God bless, and enjoy your study of God's Word through the Sabbath Bible lessons. Bye for now.